welcome to Spotlight. I'm Rian Keating. Today we're visiting Lore Noto, the producer of the Fantasticks. And we're at the Sullivan Street Theater. Mr. Noto, welcome to the show. Now this is going into its 25th year.
Your show or to my show? Which show am I being welcomed to?
I don't know if I'm being welcomed.
You know, I want to tell you, it was so sweet to hear you say Noto. Everybody says, No-to. And I was delighted to hear Noto. That's where I grew up. Hey, Noto.
This is going into its 25th year this month, and thinking back 25 years ago when you saw the Barnard production with Susan Watson and Ron Liebman, what was your first impression of it?
I thought it was kind of crazy, actually. No, I had my experience with it was before I saw it on a stage of any kind. I had heard it done in an acting workshop where Mr. Baker had brought it. And he came to take over somebody's class and being summoned almost summarily, actually, to take over the class for another director. He brought some scripts with him, and he had each of the kids, and the boys and the girls, separately read the opening speech of the boy and the girl. So I had no idea it was a musical, and I heard this material, and I said, you know, it's about time somebody brought some size and style to theater language. It's been a long time. It just caught my ear. And when I pursued it and found out later it was a musical, I wound up at a dress rehearsal at Barnard, and the girl was not singing, but fat. Well, he wasn't that fat. I shouldn't say that. A pianist was playing, singing and playing, but singing her songs for her. And I thought, well, my gosh, if that isn't the ball soprano. UNESCO, I believe, wrote the Ball Soprano, which is a far-out avant-garde piece of work. And I loved it. I just thought it was wonderful. It was in a short version, a one-act play. And they had a ladder for the wall. The fathers went up and down the ladder and met up and down the ladder. And I must say I enjoyed it. But when I was in the men's room, I heard, after the show, I heard people whistling, Try to Remember. And I said, you know, they liked it. If they're going to remember to whistle, Try to Remember, they like what they heard. Mm-hmm. And I was pleased then to pursue it.
Well, there was one thing at that time which was known as kitchen sink dramas. And I guess you wanted a little variation for it.
Demanded variation. I think, in fact, right now it's about time maybe we ought to blow up what's around in all our culture and just start from scratch and throw a whole bunch of this dreck out. You know, there's so much trash around, poor quality, a lack of craft.
So you found the Fantasticks to be simple, but...
Well, it wasn't that it was simple. You know, simplicity is a very hard thing to achieve. It's very deep. The Fantasticks is very deep, and audiences recognize this where the so-called critics, I mean, I get anybody can criticize, fail to recognize its worth. But you don't fool the general public. You just, they know instinctively what is of value. Mm-hmm. I remember during the Depression, I was a kid that grew up during the Depression, people always gravitated toward two places that I recall. And those, I wound up later knowing one of the men who was involved in one of the operations. One of the operations was Horn and Hardart. And people would go there because they had, for their nickel, a darn good cup of coffee. I think for a dime they had an excellent pot of beans, and everything was... It was low priced, but the quality was superb. And chock full of nuts was the other one. And, you know, people care about value. And I think that high-handed attitudes about people's awareness and perceptions and realities are the biggest mistake society makes. You don't really hustle the public. You might get away with it for a while. But you cannot keep throwing trash at them. There's going to be an artistic backlash, and I feel it's coming very strongly again. And as far as kitchen sink and chips dramas go, it was due. It was time. People needed more style, more size, larger than life. People don't want to be told over and over again that we all stink.
Well, the critics, you had once said, were very supportive of those kitchen sink dramas.
Oh, still are today. Still are today. Now they're beginning to turn a little on diaper dramas. What do they call them now? They always got a new name for it. Somebody's changing somebody's underwear drama. But we deal in style and size and the aspiration, the realization, the aspiration of the human spirit. This is what the Fantasticks meant to me and what it means to the audiences.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, when you first opened, you only got one rave review, and that was from a critic who had brought a drunken friend.
Well, that was the first review that we received from the first reviews we received that night after we opened. You know, you usually meet at an advertising agency, and I suppose in those days we might have had television, and you turn on your television set and see what the so-called TV people have to say, and then you get the first rushes of the newspaper reviews. So of that first batch, yes, that was the only one. But the next morning, World Telegram and Sun came out with a wonderful, wonderful review. Actually, it was basically an afternoon paper. And so that turned the tide emotionally for me, because my feeling was, after these reviews came out, and there was a real wet rag thrown on this so-called celebration party, which you always hope to have after an opening, was that it helped my morale tremendously to recognize that the thing I told my wife the night before, when everything seemed to be sliding down the toboggan ride to destruction, that I was determined I was going to continue to keep the show running, because if this couldn't make it as a piece of artistic contribution, then what could? And what would I know? I wouldn't know anything. I'd be stupid. I mean, here I believed in something that was a joy, it was thrilling, it was fun, it was exciting, it was theatrical, it dealt with very simple relationships with people that are highly complicated relationships. And it was well performed, well written. I mean, the lyricism of the work, as you know, it was written in verse primarily. And the music is just out of this world, as still is today. I can listen to it as I do, appearing in the show night after night, 8 times a week, and hear it thousands of times during auditions when people come and audition, and rehearsals and so on. And I hear it in elevators, I hear it in restaurants, I hear it in a dental chair. But I never tire of it. It just thrills me to hear that quality of work. And I always think of the old date nut bread and chocolate and nuts and the wonderful little crullers they had, the whole wheat crullers and a cup of coffee. So we're not a big, schlitzy, glitzy, hype Broadway musical. We are what we are, a unique, distinctive, simple, in that sense, contribution to American theater. And we do stay humble about it. I may sound arrogant to you, but I really am not. I'm just grateful that we have reached the audiences. So they've reached us.
Well, when it opened, you were 36, and it didn't look like it was going to make it past that first summer. And you had 3 children at that time, and you had $2,500 in the bank, which you decided to...
A little more than that. I don't know. Somebody always keeps changing those figures. I had about over $3,000 in the bank, and actually every last cent of it went in to get the curtain up. But go ahead. I guess I was just correcting the amount. But
well, at that
I like to deal in threes. The Fantasticks had a big 3 when it was done at Barnard. It had a big 3 on it, and it was really 3. It wasn't. I don't know where that figure came from, but somebody released it. But go ahead.
But at that time, when you have your life savings, what, outside of the simple lyricism of the show, compelled you to, take that risk?
Desperation. I was desperate. I already made all the commitments. When you produce a show, you've already laid out your money, you've laid out your time, you've made your investment. Now you've got to get people to return it, to invest in it, so you can return the money that you've invested up to that point back to yourself for survival. And so I had gone right down to the end, and we weren't getting the money. We couldn't raise it. We were about almost to the penny, short of about $100 and something, 100 and pennies, short of the total capitalization, and that's precisely what my life savings were. So I had to put that in there to legalize the venture, which means file with the state of New York, and entitle us legally to the right to use the monies that people have already been putting in up to that point, as I say, which is about 1/5 of the total short. And so by putting that money in, I had to start the first previews, which was enough to get us into previews for 4 or 5 week rehearsal period and all of the outlays, the advances, and so on. So that during previews, people working on the show began to see the finished production. We had the set designer; he picked up 2%. One of the lead players in it picked up another 1%, and gradually all $3,000 was sent back. With the exception of $100 and something, which I gave in pennies, I gave to my mother-in-law as a gift, because my wife and I were here sweating out night after night whether we could ever hang on to the investment we made to just protect the outlay. And so that was enough to keep me going financially for the long period, which was 11 of the first 12 weeks were lost weeks, actually lost money. And so the income to a producer, as you know, is not returnable. There is no income until the original investment, the capitalization of the show, is returned to the investors. So I'm living on 1% of the gross. We're doing $2,800, $2,300. I was getting $23, $28. But I was able to make it through the period, and then eventually, 11 months at this theater, at the box office, we were able to return the capital. 11 months, well into February of the following year.
But even
so I made it. So, but survival, really, was desperation. What choice did I have? The choice was, and this is what was offered at the time, well, why don't you just make a hero of yourself? The critics didn't like it. You did a good job. You brought in a good show. Why don't you close it now? And if you have any reserve, which we had, by the way, give it to the investors. You'll be a hero, so you'll get money for the next show. Well, I chose not to do that because that wasn't what the investment was made for. The investment was made to put this show on. People who invested in Fantasticks cared about it. They loved this work, just as I did. And when you have people putting in $14 and $15 and $60 increments like that, that was a lot of money for people who had no money. We didn't get the big dough in. So they cared. They would even tell me, look, we're not interested in making money. We believe that this is something that should be done. We care about it. It's a good piece of work. So I felt not only a commitment to them, and to myself and my family and children, but I was determined to stay with it and see where it would go. And as long as we could keep it afloat, it was going to stay afloat.
Once that momentum and word of mouth had spread, what sort of audiences did you attract? Was it a cross-section?
Well, during the struggling days, we lost money 11 of the first 12 weeks, and it was quite a while before it started to really get to feel like it was successful. Actually, we opened in May. We went to East Hampton, I believe, in July of that year for 1 week, and then, of course, that began, because we weren't here for a week, we began to build up some kind of box office reserve, so that when we came back from East Hampton that following week, the calls were being held here. We were able to tell people honestly that we were sold out, which we were. We were sold out in East Hampton for doing the show for somebody else, but they say, oh, wonderful, and that's got a lot of interest in it. And people would book for the following week and so on. If they were Tuesday night audiences, they would book for the following Tuesday and so on. So with the Tuesday night audience, plus the activity that was going on in East Hampton, and the publicity that was coming to the show, was mostly given by word of mouth, by people who would go out of their way to tell people that they saw a wonderful piece of work that is struggling off-Broadway, and that when it gets back to the city, they should see it. And they were putting their own commitments on the line. They were paying for the phone calls themselves. They were having people come and see it. And so when we got back, we started to look like we were going to make it in August. we have since found out that August somehow is a very big month in the theater off-Broadway anyway. Don't ask me why, but for one strange reason, there's 1 month, August, that seems to do business in off-Broadway. Okay, so we learned that with that combination thing, we're able to get enough capital to keep going right through until a week or two before Christmas, when we got an advance against a foreign production. London. Mm-hmm. It's going to be done in London. So we got an advance against that production. Another producer was going to produce it over there. So gave us some capital against the rights, which enabled us to go right into February, which is the time when we return our money to the investors.
You had released the stock rights relatively early in the run.
That was part of the package. It was the London rights and the stock rights were part of the same package. We had an advance of a few $1,000s against that, which of course helped keep the reserve up. My feeling about the reserve, let me tell you, this was very simple. We came in with about, that's nearer to the $2,500 figure, I believe, the $2,500 figure reserve. Somebody must have gotten that confused in their mind, but that sounds about what it was. And that reserve, I looked at it, and when we were performing for very small audiences, I had two principles in mind. One was that if the quality of the work is there, the show is good, and you would maintain your standards, that the people coming to a somewhat empty theater will see a piece of work and recognize for themselves that it was awfully easy to get into the show, no matter what the outside conversation is about a piece of work. Oh, you can't get tickets. You know, people have very, very strange attitudes. Not strange. I mean, they'll be treated strangely by box office personnel, you know. And they can be treated shabbily and high-handedly. And so I've seen it myself where people are told the show is sold out when there are plenty of tickets available. And it's a stunt that's being pulled to make people think, hey, let's see if they can demand to come in. You know?
Well, that's very interesting. David Merrick pulls the stunt with 42nd Street. Some seats are available this week. And if you go to the box office, you'll find out that there are plenty of seats.
Plenty of seats, yeah. Well, it's a tactic that's used in the theater, and I thought it was more important to get the 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people in the theater, and they saw how easy it was. All you have to do is buy a ticket. You know, you don't have to go to the broker. You don't have to hem and haw and clear your voice and wonder how much is this particular guy going to hold me up for, or scalpers could be running around with, hey, psst, want a ticket to the Fantasticks? You know, actually, when we were running about a year, the New York Times called me up and said, "What is this? Are you scalping tickets?" I happened to be in the box office where the phone was when I was called in. And I said to the New York Times, well, I'm standing right here at the rack, and there are plenty of tickets here. If you know any scalpers that want them, I'll sell them cheap. You know? And the guy says, the reporter, the guy that's the investigator for the Times said, well, all right, Mr. Noto, I guess I believe you. Now, did we touch your point about, what was the question?
What was the question? Releasing stock rights.
Right, so... we had, I said there were two parts to that. One was to give the audience attention, and the other part of it was that I believe firmly that if you kept running and you had a $2,500 advance, if you could break a little, almost up to break even, say you lose $1,000 a week, okay, we could go for 2 weeks because we had 20, and maybe 2.5 weeks. It never got to the point where we ever were in that much difficulty that the show had to close because we ran out of money. We always managed to keep a little. We'd lose money, as I say, 11 of the first 12 weeks, and we've had losing weeks even since then. We've never gotten to the point where it looks like we've just got to close because the audiences aren't coming and there's no money left. And it's gone up, and down, and then somehow comes up again, you know, in terms of graphs. We've done graphs to show precisely what its pattern is. It goes up and it comes down.
Around 1970, you thought it looked like it might close, and...
That's one down there, yeah.
That's when you got what you term as your life sentence?
Exactly. That was it. I had, for the first decade, only filled in on an emergency basis. As you're probably aware, I stepped in one Sunday matinee because one of the difficulties off-Broadway is, or a concession actually, I shouldn't be unfair to Actors' Equity, they allow actors to leave for more remunerative employment. It means if they get a bigger buck elsewhere, they can go grab it, because our scale is fairly low here compared to what actors are entitled to on Broadway. So the guy got a U.S. Steel show, and so I jumped into the part in the first June after we opened, the first month or two after we opened. But for the first whole decade, the first 10 years, I had toyed with the idea of, as I say, we were looking up the graph, going up and down or whatever, that when it got to the point where it looked like it was going to close, I'd settle to be the last father in the show, the last boy's father. And so I got in there in 1970 because we were right at the very bottom. It looked like it had come from a big, big high down to, and no even indication that it would pick up again. So I went into the show, and I suppose maybe I'm box office because it started to go up. And it's been going up a little bit, it slumps a little bit, and it goes up a little bit. And it's again, because of that principle I told you, that it never was in real danger ever since. I've been here more than half the run.
Do you see any end in sight?
I never saw an end in sight ever. I guess that you just don't know how long the show is going to run. You have no way. How do you know? Shows close for a number of reasons. Sometimes people are just darn out and out bored with it. They're tired of it. They figure, oh, it's labor. I've never felt that way about this work artistically. This is not labor. This is a joy. The actors who come into the show love to do this work. It's important to them as young artists to develop and hone their craft, and so it never gets tired. And when we do come across an occasional disinterested performer who's more interested in his own selfish career as opposed to the work of the theater, which is what they become actors and performers for, we hopefully find a way to see that they're no longer with us. And so, what was the question again? Every time I think about a situation like that, I begin to...
Did you think there was any end in sight?
And so, no, the show's close for a number of reasons, is what I was saying. And there's no reason to see the end of it as we never did originally, because it's a question of the public coming, and the public is beating our doors down now to get to the show, which is a rare thing for me to say, because for 23 years or thereabouts, I've been saying that we need an audience, and we still welcome them and do need them. But somewhere around this fall of last year, an activity started to take place in the theater at the box office, and there became a great deal of interest in the Fantasticks. People would say, wow, are you in your 24th year? And all of a sudden, the numbers 2 and 4 sort of caught fire. And if anybody is what do you call those lottery people? 2 and 4, stay with 2 and 4, because that's been very good for us. 2 and 5, I don't know, but 2 and 5 is 7.
Well, I think people tend to think of the Fantasticks now as a landmark, something like the Statue of Liberty.
Well, we used to hear that, and we'd see 3 or 4 people in an audience here, and we'd say, well, why did you come to see us? Well, because you're an institution. I said, forget the institution baloney. Tell your friends there are plenty of seats. Because how often, you know, I mean, if I had to run the concession at the Empire State Building, I don't think we'd be here very long. How much money could they make?
Well, certainly the last 25 years have seen a lot of change towards America's musical attitudes. Have you ever been concerned with performers losing good voice training and that sort of thing?
Oh, absolutely. That is vital to our survival. And as long as the talent keeps seeking us out, and we're fortunate enough to find them, that's another one of the reasons why a show can close, because the times they are a-changing. And you got the little boy singers with little boy voices. And who wants to learn how to sing? Who wants to learn how to act? When you can get away with anything, put on a white glove and
Oh, you might just have a whole new career ahead of you.
You're putting on white gloves?
Yes.
On my ear. I'll put a white glove on my ear.
But how do you keep your performance fresh after 14 years?
My performance is, of course, a question of training. I'm heavily trained as an actor, and I understand precisely the need to find a new way to approach the particular same familiar material. I suppose that if you couldn't say hello 400 different ways, you might just as well not say hello when you get up in the morning or when you meet somebody. Just don't say, oh, good morning. There are many ways you can do these things, and you have to just keep shuffling them around in your own experience. As far as an actual technique goes, I suppose that mine is a risky one, because I consider myself living dangerously, because I try not to know what's coming next. I try strongly to not, and this is the thing I fight against, is if I say yes and the other person says no, I don't, and in the script, I don't want to hear him say no. I don't want to know what he's going to say. So when I say yes, and I expect a yes, and he always says no, and then I can work with that, and that keeps it for me fresh. It's risky because I can get lost out there on that basis sometimes, and you hope to gosh that you will remember when the time comes what you are committed to say, what you're committed to do. You've got to, if I'm to turn left, I have to turn left because that's directorial responsibility of that particular staging. But if I turn left and then suddenly something pulls me back right, whatever it is, a hand, a voice, a sound, or whatever, I've got to make sure that I'm moving in that direction, and that moment returns me to the other direction. It's a little technical, I suppose, Ryan, but it's about the only way I can explain it. But that's what actors are trained to do. That's a responsibility.
Well, our time is up, and I thank you for allowing us the opportunity to interview you. This is Rian Keating, and you've been watching Spotlight with guest Lore Noto. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can write to myself in care of Perot Productions, 640 10th Avenue, New York, New York, 10036. Spotlight airs Tuesday evenings on Channel D, and again Saturday mornings on Channel C. Tuesday is at 8:30, and Saturday mornings is at 11:30. Be sure to join us next week when our guest will be Ward Baker. Until then, have a good week.
Who's he?
Gee, I don't know.